Welcome to Flora and Friends, your botanical cup of tea, a podcast for plant lovers of any kind. We welcome guests to our botanical tea break to explore the history, science and meaning of plants for our lives. My name is Judith Lundberg-Felten. I'm a plant scientist, university researcher and founder of Flora-L Design, and I'm the hostess of your botanical cup of tea. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Pelargonium series of the Flora and Friends podcast. Today I will share with you the first half of an interview that I have had with Matija Strlic, who is the chairman of the International Geraniacea Group. Matija is also a professor in heritage science and analytical chemistry in the UK and in Slovenia. But a big, deep and long-yeared free-time passion for him have been the Pelargonium. And that's why Matija has traveled a lot to South Africa, discussed and even worked in his free time together with botanists there to learn more about Pelargoniums. And he's extremely knowledgeable, and it was extremely nice to talk to him. And his knowledge has inspired so many questions that I recorded a very long episode and decided to cut it into two so that you will be able to enjoy the second part next week on Wednesday. In this first part, we have discussed a bit about how Matthias found into the Pelargoniums and this interest, how it has developed for him, but also how Pelargoniums are classified into different sections and which kind of Pelargoniums you can find in different parts of the world. And then next week we are going to address a little bit more climate change and anthropogenic activities and how those are impacting Pelargoniums, as well as some more information about the International Geraniacea Group and resources about Pelargoniums. I hope you will enjoy both parts of this interview, and with this I say welcome to Matija Strlic from the International Geraniacea Group.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you very much for your invitation.
You're a professor and have a science background, but how did your enthusiasm for Pelargoniums start? Where did it start? How did it start? And how did you grow from there?
I tried to analyze this with myself, to be honest, several times, but never quite understood how this enthusiasm developed. Like many young people, 30, 40 years ago, I was enthusiastic about plants generally. And I remember gardening with my grandmother and how smelly those Pelargoniums were that she used to grow. And I can't remember whether I really liked that smell at the time, to be honest. And then I fell for cacti and succulent plants and suddenly discovered that there is a whole wealth of botanical Pelargoniums that very few people knew much about. And that nostalgically took me back to the plants that my grandmother grew. So I think the nostalgia combined with my interest in unusual shapes and forms that Pelargoniums provide in abundance. And I think that's where I got really hooked.
Mm-hmm. How long have you been growing them for?
That's a very good question. I think very intensively, probably for the past 25 years.
Okay. And what is your collection of Pelargoniums like today?
Today, it looks half dead, to be honest. But a lot of the plants, as you know, have two very distinct active periods. They usually have a green period, which is when they grow leaves and become really active during the winter. And then towards the end of the winter, early spring, when the hot weather starts, the leaves wither. And then during the spring and during the summer, they start flowering. These are the so-called winter growing pelargoniums. And they are pretty much in the majority. And very few people who don't, a few people who don't have a good understanding of how to grow pelargoniums get this aspect wrong. They don't really quite understand which plants come from winter rainfall regions, which ones come from summer rainfall regions. And if you mix this up, very often plants will not grow well and may die. So right now, half of my plants are at the stage where their leaves have started to wilt, and the other half are firmly at the peak of their flowering period. So it's just an absolute pleasure to come back from work, get immediately into the greenhouse, and just enjoy yourself.
Do you have a heated greenhouse?
Well, my collection is in Ljubljana, Slovenia. So typically we get a couple of days during the winter of -15, down to -17 degrees. And there are no pelargoniums that would survive such low temperatures. There are a few from the central Karoo that can survive temperatures down to -10, -8 degrees, but usually not for a very long period of time. These would be very cold winter mornings when you get those low temperatures. But then immediately as the sun shows up, the entire landscape warms up, and the ground rarely actually freezes over. So you will get pelargoniums that survive, say, 1 or 2 freezing nights of freezing temperatures, but cannot grow during very long periods of freezing weather, except a species that grows in central Anatolia in Turkey. Your listeners may know that the genus is distributed all the way from Turkey over the Rift Valley and then into South Africa, with a few species in Australia and New Zealand. But those that grow in central Turkey survive at very, very high altitudes and covered with a thick layer of snow during the winter. So those can survive even long winters in the northern hemisphere.
Okay, they would be perfect for growing in Sweden then.
There are a few growers, enthusiasts in Sweden who successfully grow them outdoors. That's absolutely right.
Yeah, well, how many species do you have in your collection?
The collection is growing as we exchange seeds and plants with our colleagues, and right now I think I grow about 150 species or so out of possibly 280, 300 species in the genus as a whole. There are a few species that are difficult to come across because they are not horticulturally very interesting, and that basically grow like weeds. So very few people are interested in those except a few botanists, and it's difficult to come across seeds of those. The rest of the species are really interesting. Either they grow into large shrubs and flower profusely, such as the well-known Zonale group of species, section Pelargonium. And then there is a large group of species that grow in arid regions of South Africa, Australia, and elsewhere. And those are of interest to succulent enthusiasts. So those are, again, a little bit easier to come across.
Maybe we can go back to this aspect of classification. What kind of classification is used, what it is based on, what would you say as having been in touch with pelargoniums?
So from from a purely botanical perspective, the genus is divided into sections. The sections are based on, or clustering into sections is based on morphological and genetical characteristics. And some of them make a lot of sense to horticulturalists, others perhaps slightly less. But the majority of those sections are pretty easily recognizable. For example, section Peristera is the section with weedy species types that are rarely grown in collections, actually. Section Huarea is the section with thick tubers that are shielded by a papery tunic, and those are grown by, for example, succulent enthusiasts. Then there are sections Otidia and Cortuzina that have very thick stems, and similarly, other sections can be recognized on the basis of morphology or flower shape or number of fertile stamens and similar. This is botany. From a horticultural perspective, it is most usual or most useful even to divide species into summer growing and winter growing species. The majority of cultivars that are grown on windowsills world around are descendants of 2 or 3 species, such as Pelargonium zonale and similar. And these are all summer growing species, which is why they do so well as summer plants. But as I mentioned earlier, the majority of species in the genus actually come from areas with winter rainfall. These are areas that extend from Lüderitz in South Namibia all the way down along the Atlantic coast of Western South Africa, around Cape Town, and then along the south coast of Western Cape and Eastern Cape towards Port Elizabeth. So this is a fairly broad, perhaps 200-kilometer ribbon of land that mainly receives rain in the winter, during winter, but may receive scant rain year-round as well. These plants require slightly different horticultural conditions, so high levels of sunlight during winter, and obviously rain or watering during winter time as well. These are slightly more difficult to grow in the northern hemisphere, for example, especially because very often we need to provide slightly more sunlight or artificial lighting, if we can, to grow them well.
Okay, that was a great classification. I think that's something that I now can relate to. And also, I think we discussed that in the very first episode about the pelargoniums, that, for example, if one wants to cross pelargoniums, one needs to stay in the same section of pelargoniums. Is that
often
true?
But not entirely true. Some of the members of our International Geraniacea Group have been doing really interesting experiments, producing crosses between sections.
Okay.
So, for example, one of the latest super exciting crosses was between, for example, Pelargonium oblongatum from the Huarea geophytic section with Pelargonium, with a very tall shrubby Pelargonium from the section Pelargonium. So that was a hugely surprising cross. I think some of the individual species within some of the sections are such extreme examples of their genetics that they can still cross and with a species from other sections, and those are the really interesting examples.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Do you do any crossing, or do you try to keep your pelargoniums as pure as possible?
I enjoy looking at crosses, and I think they tell us an awful lot about relationships between sections and species, but I don't do any hybridization myself. It's not because I'm a purist or anything, but there are 300 species as it is. And in addition, each taxon comes with so many of its own variability that I decided to specialize myself to try and keep them as pure as possible. Because what I enjoy mostly is to look at the same species, but from different locations. Because if you look at species that are very broadly distributed, for example, Pelargonium luteolum, and then you start looking at the characteristics of that one species in the Western Cape, and then in the Southern Cape, and then in the Eastern Cape, you start seeing very interesting patterns that have never been systematically studied before. And that really excites me.
What can this pattern consist of?
For example, Pelargonium luteolum is a very curious species. It has a sister species called Pelargonium gracillimum. And where these two species meet, the yellow flowers that are typical of Pelargonium luteolum and the pink flowers that are typical of Pelargonium gracillimum actually turn into white flowers that can be either of the two species. But the research that I've done in the past few years has also shown that the nectar tubes that are typically slightly shorter in Pelargonium luteolum start becoming longer and longer as you move eastwards until you get to the typical Pelargonium gracillimum. But once you start moving ever slightly more east, those longer hypanthia, the nectar tubes, start becoming shorter and the petals yellow again. So this really questions us and really questions our understanding of the two species. Is it really two species, or is it really just varieties of the same species that have evolved and adapted to specific pollinators? There is an awful lot of research here still to be done.
That was my next question about the pollinators. Is there anything known that the pollinators are very different if the nectar tubes are so different in length?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And there's quite a lot of ongoing research on this topic. In fact, a couple of years ago, when we still traveled to South Africa, one of the most interesting days that I spent with a couple of botanists was trying to catch flies in the Northern Cape, because those flies have awfully long proboscis, the tongues, if you like. And some of those nectar tubes can be up to 11 centimeters long. So the length of that proboscis can be 5 times the length of the fly. These are enormously interesting creatures to look at. And of course, the length of those flower tubes co-evolved with the length of the proboscis of the flies. And there are species pairs, i.e. fly and plant, that evolved together, and understanding those mechanisms of evolution is extremely interesting and tells us a lot about the process of speciation in many South African plants, not just Pelargoniums.
That's fascinating how this how it can be so small distances that make such a difference. But also, I mean, if we look at South Africa, I have unfortunately never been there, but looking at the map, one can see there's many different types of landscapes. You have the lowlands, you have mountains. Where do we find Pelargoniums there, and are they very different species depending on the different types of landscapes?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Plus, let's not forget we have two oceans, the warm Indian Ocean and the cold Atlantic. So together with the geology and surface morphology, which is extremely dynamic, and you mentioned very tall mountains and very fertile and very wet valleys that that slowly descend into the central Karoo, which is very flat and dry, mainly. Not all of the Karoo is like that, but some of it is. South Africa provides for an immense diversity of habitats. And from valley to valley, you can get completely different morphologies, completely different populations of species. And it is very often the case that you have certain species that are so highly specialized that they only occur in a small area of, say, 5 by 5 kilometers. And with South Africa being so huge, there are so many areas potentially that we still haven't discovered. And on an annual basis, we get reports of new species being discovered. So this is just an absolutely interesting area of research for botanists. Due to all this diversity, you have the tall shrubby species that occupy the south of this distribution area. So along the southern coast with the warm weather provided by the Indian Ocean, lots of humidity, fairly higher rainfalls. But as you move northwards along the Atlantic coast and cold winds and winter rainfall, you get lower rainfalls as well. So the species had to adapt and became smaller. So you have those really miniature geophytes that you will find in the Namaqualand. And then as you move a little bit northwards, you get large and tall shrubby and succulent species that survive on 100 or 200 millimeters of rain a year. So real desert survivors like no other. And that has just always fascinated me to no end.
This has been now, this has been brought so many follow-up questions to me. Now I need to organize my thoughts. One of them is you seem to have traveled to all these places. Is this true?
If I only can, pandemic permitting, I travel to South Africa every year. I mostly travel in our northern summer, meaning that I can only see pelargoniums in leaf in the winter, which many botanists dislike because pelargoniums typically start flowering in the spring. But I've trained my eye such that I can see pelargoniums even if they're not flowering, and that allows me to see surprisingly a lot. Because in order to see a pelargonium when it flowers, you have to be there while it flowers. And the flowering period of several species is limited to 2 or 3 weeks. But if I'm there in the winter and I see them in leaf, I can see all of them. So I get to see a lot more than those people who only travel in, say, December or January or February when pelargoniums typically flower. Because I teach, I can only travel in July or August. So I only get to see plants during their winter time.
Yeah, that challenge has been a real opportunity for you to learn to distinguish them why they don't flower.
I think so. And it's really quite amazing to see. And I've never seen pelargoniums in flower, at least those that flower in spring or summer, in nature. And it's an absolute delight to see pictures of plants from nature in flower, because that's not how I remember them. I remember the landscape green and lush and full of plant life. But when they decide to flower, it's all half dead. And it's a completely different landscape.
And it's I think it's so fascinating that you say there's such an interest in the botany of these plants. Is this special for Pelargonium, or is this just like a genus of any other that is very interesting? Or yeah,
I think and this is just my observation as a non-botanist, obviously. I think the peak of interest in the genus was probably in the 1980s and 90s, with the real greats being Professor van der Waals, for example, or Professor Murray, who did an awful lot of research into this genus and described many new species, published monographs, PhD theses, and so on. The interest then waned slightly. We see a lot of interest in other genera currently, for example, various monocots and similar. There has always been lots of interest in succulents because of the market, I suppose. But right now, I wouldn't see that the genus is particularly popular, at least in South Africa. And I'm not critical here at all. But for example, the really great collections of living Pelargoniums in Stellenbosch at the University Botanical Garden there, those collections have really declined since the 90s, for example. I think this is quite usual because curators have their own interests and botanists have their own interests. But I think that in the last perhaps 5 or 10 years, the interest increased again, particularly because of the subject that you already mentioned, which is pollination studies. Pelargoniums have become, again, a little bit more interesting because of their longer nectar tubes, and that has put them firmly into the focus of researchers interested in pollination studies. Not as a genus of its own, but as a genus of plants that enable long proboscis flies to gather nectar. And we've seen a lot of recent research into the particular issue of long-tubed Pelargonium pollination.
This was the first of 2 parts of the interview with Matija. Next Wednesday, we are going to discuss more about climate change and how human activities are impacting Pelargoniums, and you will also get a few tips where to go to South Africa if you want to see lots of fantastic Pelargoniums. And finally, Matija will also talk more about the International Geraniacea Group and how you can get resources and more information from them. With this, I want to say thank you for today. If you haven't listened to the other episodes on Pelargonium or our previous mini-series on nasturtium, visit us at www.flora-l.com/blog and find all episodes there, as well as on our YouTube channel, on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and Deezer, where you can listen to this podcast. If you are on our website and would like to keep yourself informed about future episodes or other news about Flora-L, then sign up for our newsletter. Thank you for listening today. Have a great day, and I hope to see you back here next week.